In 1911, a Croatian man named Joseph Ladisic sailed from Germany to Ellis Island. It took about a week. He was following family and a couple of friends who had made that journey before him. And he managed to get to Chicago, where he found a job at the Great Lakes Shipping Company. So instead of looking out over the Adriatic Sea, he was looking out over Lake Michigan. Now, life in Croatia had been difficult. There was poverty, there was no good avenue out of it, there was a sense of hopelessness. And Joseph left all of that behind. But he also left behind his wife, Catherine, and their 3-year-old daughter, Lucille. Joseph had arrived in his own promised land, and now his job was to reunite his family. Now, in our reading today, we have the words of Moses instructing the Israelites to move into their promised land. They have been at a mountain, and it is time to take the next step to actually enter the land. And they need the courage and they need the voice of Moses to guide them. Now, when Pastor Jake read for us this morning, it comes from Deuteronomy, which I have heard from an anonymous source who is Jewish and works in the church office, that if we did not have any of the books except the book of Deuteronomy, we would have enough. Because Deuteronomy is a retelling of the law. The Deuteronomist is the narrator of this book who reaches back into the past, listens for the voice of Moses, and pulls it forward to a generation that lives today, and then gives them the guidance they need to move into their promised land. Now, the entire book is made up mostly of speeches by Moses. There are 3 separate speeches that Moses gives. And then this narrator invites us in at the beginning of the book and sends us on our way at the end. And that's how we know it's probably not all written by Moses. This narrator, the Deuteronomist, lived probably centuries after Moses, at least according to critical scholars like Pete Enns. Now, the important thing is that we understand that Moses and the Israelites, when he first gave the law, were all on one side of the Jordan River, and the Israelites who are receiving this text from the Deuteronomist are on the other side of the river. Moses and the Israelites that first came out of Egypt never got to the promised land. They had rebelled, and God's punishment was that they would never enter, not even Moses. So the Deuteronomist reaches back over the water to get the words from Moses and pulls it across from the past to the present, and then gives it to a people who need to remember that God is with them and that God is leading them forward on their journey. Joseph is also across the river, separated by water from his family. Now, he is a devout man, and he is hardworking. He gets up early every single morning and goes to Mass at a Catholic church before he goes to work. And then he works hard and saves all of his money, and he does this for a year, saving every penny he can so he has enough money to reunite his family. Eventually, he thinks he has enough. He sends it to Catherine, but when she gets the money, she realizes there is only enough for one. In Joseph's letter to Catherine, he said, "Leave our daughter in Croatia. This is all the money I have." But he wanted Catherine to come and join him. Catherine refused. There are some things we just cannot give up. So Joseph found out he had to work for another year to raise the money to have enough to send it back to Croatia so that Lucille could also come. By the time he does this, Lucille is 5 years old. Catherine finally receives enough money for both of them to board a ship in Germany to make that trip across the Atlantic. And as Catherine is getting ready for all the things that have to be done, she's packing and she's saying goodbye, and she's saying goodbye not just to people, but to the place where she had loved to live, the only place that was home. While she did all of that, Lucille did what 5-year-old girls do. She played with the kittens. She loved the kittens. If you've ever seen a 5-year-old with kittens, they hold them, around the neck, and they squeeze them, and they love them, and they kiss them. And the kitten scratched her face, scratched both her eyes, and she became terribly infected from those scratches. So Catherine had to spend a little bit of that precious money on an ointment to put on Lucille's eyes. In the hubbub of packing and getting to Germany and boarding the SS St. Louis, Catherine forgot the medicine. They boarded the ship, and Lucille could remember years later that trip because it was traumatic. The seas were raging, and there was icy blasts of water coming over the rail of the ship, and she even remembered seeing a woman nearly swept overboard. But a man, quickly thinking, grabbed her skirts and hauled her back over the rail. And after that, Catherine kept Lucille beneath the deck. It was dark, and it was cramped. The infection in Lucille's eyes was raging. They were fed rancid food, and the little girl became very ill. And Catherine prayed. Sometimes the journey is so difficult. Sometimes we forget how far we've come, and we forget what people have done to sacrifice for us to all be here together today. The Israelites must have felt, I can't imagine how they must have felt when they realized they would never enter the promised land. They could only see it across the water. I think their only consolation would be that their children would enter, that things would be better for their children, and in that they must have taken some hope. But when those children grew up, and they did cross that river, they sent out spies. If you remember your Old Testament stories, the spies looked at the inhabitants of the land and said, they are like giants. We are like grasshoppers in their eyes, and they were all afraid. Now, Lucille thought she saw a giant as well when the ship finally arrived at Ellis Island, when she looked up and saw the Statue of Liberty. Her vision was cloudy. She could barely make out what she was seeing, but no one was afraid. Everyone cheered. They waited in long lines of immigrants to have their papers processed so that they could go into this promised land. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited, and when they finally got to their place, they received some devastating news. Catherine was cleared for entry into the United States, but Lucille was denied because there was a law that said no one with an infectious disease was allowed to enter. They were trapped on Ellis Island. Catherine could not go back. She had no money to get aboard another ship. Lucille could not go forward. Catherine desperately searched for someone who could understand her language so that she could communicate what they needed. Meanwhile, Joseph arrived on the mainland with every dollar he could beg or borrow. Catherine eventually found, after at least a week, she found a sympathetic nurse who did not need language to look at Lucille's eyes and understand what was needed. The nurse gave them the medicine they needed, and Catherine began to use it, and Lucille slowly began to get better. Meanwhile, Joseph made a sizable financial contribution to persons unknown. And suddenly, Catherine heard the word she'd been waiting to hear. Go. You may go. You may go into this promised land. You may go find your husband. You may take your daughter with you. You can go. This feeling of standing on the edge of something incredible is what the Deuteronomist wants the Israelites to feel, and what God wants all of us to feel today. That we are standing on the edge of something that maybe we can't even see clearly. Maybe our vision is a little cloudy and we don't know exactly what's going to come, but we know it's going to be good. We need to remember, as the Deuteronomist wants us to remember, these voices from the past who inform us so that we can take the next step. The voice of Moses, the voice of all of those who went before us. And so we have this responsibility to continue the journey, to do the work that we've been called to do, even if we can't see it all clearly just yet. Now, the 4th of July weekend is a perfect time for us to have a text like this that invites us to go back to remember. We might remember that there were 13 colonies who together said, "We do not want a king." And with that knowledge, then we go forward. This weekend is a good time to remember that the document that guides us begins, "We the people." We have the power. No one is above the law. This is a good time of year to think about all the voices around us saying that this is a Christian nation. That is not what the 13 colonies said. They wanted religious freedom, and they were willing to die for it. This is a good time of year to think about mothers and babies at the border being separated, and then decide how we treat families that come across our borders. You see, the Deuteronomist knows those words from the past are important, and he reaches back over the Jordan and pulls forward the words of Moses so that we can hear it again, and so that we will remember that the same God that pulled the Israelites out of Egypt, the same God that led them through the desert, the same God that guided them across the Jordan, is the same God who traveled with the immigrants and the same God who travels with us. Those voices from the past inform us so that we can make a good decision. And that is why today I have shared with you the story of my great-grandmother, Catherine, who passed down her determination and her faith to my grandmother, Lucille, who passed it down to my mother, Anna, who passed it down to me. I come from a long line of very stubborn females, as some of you already know. Those voices from the past inform us today, and they give us the courage to do the work before us, even when our vision is cloudy. Now today, as this Brady Bunch of a church that we have here, we have not just Presbyterians and UCC folks. We have folks here who speak Roman Catholic and folks who speak Baptist. We have all kinds of languages. We are truly a melting pot. What do we do now? Let's imagine for a moment who you identify with the most. Maybe you are a Catherine. I am not giving this up. I don't care what Pastor Judy and Pastor Jake say. Is that you? Or maybe you're more like Joseph. You've worked so hard for over a year, and today we're going to tell you that you've got at least another year of heavy lifting before we get this thing to work. Or maybe you're more like Lucille, and you just want everybody to love one another. Let's just all play with the kitties. Let's just have a kitten church, and we'll all just snuggle with kittens the whole time we're here, and everybody will love one another and be happy. Or maybe you are more like the sympathetic nurse, and you're looking around at folks whose vision is maybe a little cloudy, and you've got your ointment, and you are going to help them see what can be. Now, this text invites us to stand on the edge of something really big and to go, to take a step, to do the work. So what does that look like? Let's set the bar very low for our first service together. I invite you all for just a moment, look at everybody else in this room and find at least one person maybe you've never spoken with, one person whose name you can't remember, somebody. And at coffee hour today, after service, walk across the room and introduce yourself. Have a conversation. Hear the stories of their family. Find out what they like and dislike. What brings them joy or fear. Just say hello. Now, if having a conversation with a total stranger freaks you out, behind door number 2, we have another choice for you. Sign up for coffee hour. If you bring food, we will love you. We will not make you say a word. Sign up for something. There's a whole bunch of sign-up sheets that Betty and I put out the other day. Find a place where you can take a step And we will all do this together, just like all of God's people, all the time, in all places, in the past, in the present, and hopefully far into the future. Together, let's go.